Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. The morning they discharged me from University of Chicago Medical Center, I rolled down the car window and breathed in the South Side air. Not because it was clean or sweet. Anyone raised on 79th Street knows October carries exhaust fumes, the grease drifting from Mr. Harold's fish shack 2 blocks down, and a cold that slides off Lake Michigan and finds every gap in whatever coat you thought was heavy enough. But it was my air. It belonged to me, and I belonged to it. And after 11 days of recycled hospital oxygen and the sharp antiseptic smell of cardiac monitoring equipment, I needed it, the way a man lost in darkness needs a familiar voice calling his name. My nephew Jerome drove me home, without talking much, which I appreciated more than I could say. He kept both hands on the wheel and the radio low. A Sunday morning gospel program neither of us commented on, and I watched the city shift block by block until the streets became the South Side I had known my entire life, and my chest finally stopped feeling like something borrowed. Jerome turned onto 79th Street, and my body sat up straighter before my mind told it to. 40 years of muscle memory, built from walking the same half block from the parking spot behind the dry cleaner to the front door of Washington's barbershop every single morning. I saw the shop before he had fully slowed the car. The hand-painted sign above the door, dark green lettering my father, James Washington, had chosen in 1971, had faded, the way honest things fade, not from neglect, but from decades of South Side weather and use. The barber pole beside the door still turned its slow red and white rotation. One bulb had been flickering since July. Dorothy had reminded me to fix it at least a dozen times. I kept saying next week. Standing on that sidewalk now, watching that faithful flicker, I thought about every next week I had let pass me by without doing what needed to be done. I thanked Jerome and stood alone on the sidewalk for a moment before going in. Through the front window, I could see Big E working. Elroy Johnson had been cutting hair inside those walls for 38 years, had started as my father's apprentice at barely 20 years old, and had grown into the kind of barber whose hands knew every head in a 6-block radius, the way a good pastor knows his congregation. He was finishing a fade on Deacon Willis from Greater Harvest Baptist. His back was to the window. But I noticed something else. A dark gray German sedan I did not recognize sat parked directly in front of the shop. And through the glass, past Big E and his client, 2 people occupied the waiting chairs along the far wall. A man in a tailored jacket, phone in hand. A woman beside him in a cream blouse, legs crossed, looking at her nails with the boredom of someone who finds most rooms beneath her. Marcus and Tiffany. My son and his wife, who had not mentioned they were coming. I pushed open the front door and the bell rang its familiar 2-note chime. The warmth of the shop came out to meet me, carrying the smell I had known my whole life, pomade and aftershave and the cedar wood of the old cabinets my father had built himself. The photographs on the walls looked back at me, my father in his army dress uniform, the shop on opening day, 1971. James Washington standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his chin raised. Decades of neighborhood men and boys, a living record of 79th Street. Big E turned from his client and his face broke into a wide smile that lasted exactly 1 second before something careful moved behind his eyes. The smile stayed, but something else shifted underneath it, present and then gone before I could name it. He said it was good to have me back. He said it the way a man says something completely true that still does not cover everything he is carrying inside. Marcus stood from the waiting chair and put out his hand. I shook it because he was my son, and that is what you do. He looked well. He looked, if I was being honest with myself, the way a man looks when things have been going his way for long enough that he has stopped being surprised by it. Tiffany rose a moment after and offered me a smile that traveled no further than her mouth. I thanked her for coming. I looked at my son and asked what brought them by on a weekday morning. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a manila envelope. He set it on the counter beside the old register, right where my father used to keep a jar of peppermint candies for the neighborhood children. And then he took a deliberate half-step back from it. He did not hand it to me. He placed it and retreated, the quiet way a man creates distance between himself and something he has already decided belongs to someone else now. I picked up the envelope and opened it. Several pages, heavy legal paper, a letterhead I did not immediately recognize, but the words printed across the top of the first page were large enough that I did not need my glasses. Notice of foreclosure. 14 days to vacate or contest. My eyes moved down to the signature lines near the bottom. 2 signatures. One belonged to a representative of something called Meridian Capital. The other was supposed to be mine. I studied that second signature for a long moment. Something about the particular way the letters were formed pulled at the back of my mind a small wrongness I could not yet name, but the word foreclosure was still thundering through my chest, too loud for anything quieter to get through. I set the envelope back on my father's counter. I looked at my son. He was watching me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 42 years of knowing him. Not guilt, not fear, something closer to patience. The patience of a man who has already prepared his answer and is simply waiting for the question to be asked. The shop was very still. Big E had not moved from his position. Outside on 79th Street, a bus rumbled past, and its sound faded into the distance. I folded my hands on the counter and waited for my son to tell me what he had done. The October wind pressed against the front window behind me. The barber pole turned. The flickering bulb held on. Marcus sat back down in the waiting chair the way a man sits when he has rehearsed the conversation he is about to have. Slowly, deliberately, like the chair belonged to him. He set his phone face down on his knee and looked at me with that same measured patience I had noticed when I first walked in, and he began to talk. He said he had been managing things while I was in the hospital. He said the shop had been running at a loss for 3 years. He said he had looked at the books and made a decision that needed to be made. He said he had arranged financing through a company called Meridian Capital, using the shop as collateral to cover the outstanding debts and keep things operational while I was recovering. He said all of this in the tone of a man explaining something reasonable to someone who might not fully understand the complexities involved. Calm. Measured. Like I was a child being told why dinner was going to be late. I did not say anything. I stood behind the counter with my hands flat on the wood my father had sanded smooth by hand in the spring of 1971, and I listened to my son tell me he had used my father's shop as collateral for a loan I had never authorized, never discussed, and never signed for. Except that I had signed for it, apparently. That second signature on the foreclosure document sat in the back of my mind like a stone in a shoe. Something about the loop of the R, something about the way the letters leaned. I had signed my name 64 years of times, and I knew the particular way my hand moved when it made those letters. What was on that document was close, but it was not mine. I filed that thought away carefully and kept my face still and let Marcus keep talking. He said the loan had come due faster than anticipated. He said Meridian had changed the terms without adequate notice. He said it was a complicated situation that he was working to resolve. He said that 14 days was actually more time than it sounded like. He said he had a plan. I noticed that the more he talked, the less the word sorry appeared in anything he was saying. I noticed that he spoke about my father's shop the way a man speaks about a property he's in the process of selling, with a kind of detached administrative concern, as though the question of its value was purely numerical, as though 53 years of 79th Street history could be reduced to a line item on a balance sheet. Big E had not moved from behind his station. Deacon Willis had gone very quiet in the chair. The two of them existed in that particular stillness that men adopt when they are witnessing something they know is not their business to interrupt, but cannot bring themselves to look away from. I was grateful for Big E's presence. There is something about having a man who has known you for 40 years standing quietly in your corner that steadies you in a way nothing else can. It was Tiffany who broke the particular shape of the conversation. She had been sitting with her legs crossed and her arms folded, and somewhere during Marcus's explanation, she had apparently decided that it was not moving fast enough in the direction she wanted. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward and said that the shop had been losing money for years, and that this neighborhood was not what it used to be, and that frankly, it was time to face facts. She said it the way people say things they have been wanting to say for a long time, and have finally found an occasion that feels like permission. She looked around the shop at the photographs, at the old cabinets at the barber pole visible through the front window, and her expression was the expression of someone appraising a property they have already decided to demolish. She said that I was 64 years old, and that I had just come out of bypass surgery, and that holding on to a building in a neighborhood like this out of sentiment was not something a man in my condition could afford. She said the word sentiment, the way you say a word when you want the person hearing it to feel small for having ever felt it. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked at my son. Marcus had the grace to look down at his phone. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from behind my father's counter. I simply said that I appreciated them coming by and that I would be in touch. Marcus stood and straightened his jacket. Tiffany picked up her purse with the efficient motion of a woman who considers the meeting concluded. They moved toward the front door together, and the bell rang its two-note chime as they went out. And then the door swung shut, and the shop was quiet again. I stood still for a moment after the sound of their car engine faded down 79th Street. Big E met my eyes in the mirror behind his station, but neither of us spoke. Deacon Willis cleared his throat softly and said he thought he would come back another time, and I told him I understood, and he let himself out. When he was gone, I turned and looked at the wall where Dorothy's mirror hung. The large oval mirror in the dark wood frame that she had insisted on hanging herself 12 years ago. The one she had carried in from the car on a Sunday afternoon and spent 40 minutes getting level while I held the drill. It was not level now. It was tilted just slightly. The left side raised a fraction of an inch higher than the right. I stood in the empty shop and stared at that mirror for a long time. Dorothy had not been a woman who left things crooked by accident. She had not been a woman who left anything by accident at all. Big E offered to stay. I told him to go home to his wife, and he looked at me the way he had been looking at me since we were young men on this same block, like he was measuring the distance between what I was saying and what I actually needed. And then he put on his coat and squeezed my shoulder on his way out and said he would be back first thing in the morning. The bell rang twice, and then I was alone. The shop settled into the particular quiet it kept after closing, a deep and layered silence that was nothing like emptiness. My father used to say the shop never really went quiet because the walls had absorbed too many conversations over too many years to ever fully let them go. Standing there in the fading afternoon light, I thought he might have been right. I could almost hear the low murmur of it, the accumulated weight of 53 years of men sitting in those chairs and telling the truth about their lives. I turned the deadbolt on the front door and flipped the sign to closed. The late October sun was dropping fast, and the light coming through the front window had gone from gold to gray. I did not turn on the overhead fluorescence. I turned on the small lamp behind the reception counter, the one Dorothy had brought in from home 7 years ago, because she said the fluorescent light made the shop feel like a waiting room instead of a place where people came to be taken care of. She had been right about that, the way she was right about most things that I had been too busy or too stubborn to notice on my own. I walked to the wall where her mirror hung. Up close, the tilt was more obvious than it had appeared from across the room. The left side was raised perhaps half an inch higher than the right, pulling the oval frame out of true in a way that would have driven Dorothy absolutely to distraction. She had spent 40 minutes getting this mirror level on the day she hung it. She had made me hold the measuring tape 3 separate times. The idea that she would have left it this way, even for a day, made no sense at all. I reached up and lifted the right side of the frame gently, intending to straighten it. The mirror swung outward on a hinge I had not known was there. Behind the mirror, recessed into the wall, was a steel door approximately 12 inches square. It had a combination dial at its center, matte black, the kind with 40 numbered positions around its face. A small safe custom-fitted into a cavity that had been cut into the plaster and the lath behind it. Someone had done the work carefully. The edges were clean. The installation was not recent, but it was not old either. I stood and looked at it for a long moment in the gray October light. Dorothy had been a woman of deliberate action her entire life. She did not acquire things without purpose or place things without intention. She had worked as a bookkeeper and accountant for businesses throughout this neighborhood for 35 years, had managed other people's financial lives with a precision that bordered on the devotional. And she had brought that same precision to everything she touched, including, apparently, the installation of a concealed safe behind a mirror in a barber shop on 79th Street. I put my hand on the combination dial. I thought about every number that had ever mattered to her. Her mother's birthday, our anniversary, the year my father opened the shop. And then I thought about the simplest and most obvious answer, the one she would have chosen because Dorothy believed that the best hiding place was always the one you could find again without having to think too hard when the moment came. I dialed in June 14th, 1962. The day Dorothy Mae Collins was born into this world. The lock released with a soft, clean click. I pulled the small door open. Inside the cavity, arranged with the neat deliberateness I recognized as entirely Dorothy's, were 3 items. A green hardcover notebook, the kind with a cloth spine and a small brass clasp on the cover. A thick manila envelope, legal weight, sealed, and a single folded piece of paper resting on top of everything else. My name written on the outside in Dorothy's handwriting, the tall, looping cursive she had used her whole life. I unfolded it with hands that were steadier than I expected them to be. The note was short, 4 sentences. Roosevelt, I knew you would find this because you always paid more attention than you let on. Everything you need is here. I love you more than this old shop and everything in it. And that is saying something. Now read. I stood in the near dark of my father's barber shop, holding my wife's last letter. And I did not cry. I had done my crying in the hospital 8 months ago, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and machinery, and I had made a private decision in that room that I was going to carry whatever came next on my feet. I folded the note and put it in my shirt pocket, close to where my chest still ached from the surgery. Then I reached back into the safe and lifted out the green notebook. It was heavier than it looked. Many of the pages had small yellow paper markers sticking up from the top edge, a dozen at least, maybe more. Dorothy had been thorough. She had always been thorough. I undid the small brass clasp and opened to the first page, and read the date written there in her careful hand, and the single line beneath it. And the particular cold that moved through me then had nothing to do with the October wind pressing against the front window of the shop. I have known my own handwriting for 60 years. I know the particular way I cross my T's with a short, flat stroke that angles slightly downward to the right. I know the way my capital R opens wide at the top before the leg kicks out at the bottom, a habit my 3rd-grade teacher, Mrs. Albright, spent an entire semester trying to correct and never managed to. I know the way my O's close completely, always, because my father told me once that a man who leaves his letters open is a man who leaves his business open, and I had taken that seriously enough as a boy that it had become permanent. I know my signature the way I know my own face in the mirror. You cannot write your name 10,000 times over 6 decades without knowing it down to the cellular level. What I was looking at on the foreclosure document was not my signature. It was close, It was studied. It was the work of someone who had spent real time learning the components. But it was not mine. I had set the green notebook aside temporarily when I pulled the manila envelope from the safe. The foreclosure notice from Meridian Capital was inside, along with 3 additional documents I had not seen before. I spread them on the counter under the small lamp Dorothy had brought from home, and I put on my reading glasses, and I went through each page with the methodical attention of a man who spent 30 years doing inventory for a wholesale food distributor and knows how to read a document for what it is actually saying, rather than what it wants you to think it is saying. The first additional document was a loan agreement dated 14 months ago for $110,000. My signature appeared on the final page. The second was an amendment increasing the loan ceiling by $40,000, dated 7 months ago, 2 weeks before my surgery. My signature appeared there as well. The third was a personal guarantee, meaning that if the shop could not cover the debt, my personal assets became liable. My signature appeared on that one too. I lined up the 3 documents side by side and looked at the signatures. They were consistent with each other in a way that real signatures across 14 months would not be. A man's signature shifts slightly over time, tightens when he is tired, loosens when he is relaxed, changes almost imperceptibly with age. These 3 signatures looked like they had been produced in the same sitting by someone working from a reference copy. The R was right, but the weight of the pen stroke was wrong. My hand presses harder at the beginning of a letter and releases toward the end. These signatures pressed evenly all the way through, like someone copying a shape rather than writing a name. I set my reading glasses on the counter and rubbed my eyes. The total liability across all 3 documents came to $180,000. $180,000 borrowed against my father's shop without my knowledge, using my name without my permission. I picked up the green notebook. I had only read the date and the first line on the opening page before I had set it down to examine the legal documents. Now I went back to it. The first entry was 8 years old. Dorothy's handwriting was steady and precise, the way it always was, each letter formed with the care of a woman who had spent decades producing documents that other people's livelihoods depended on. She had written the date, the amount the account it had been taken from, and a brief factual description of what she had discovered. $3,400 from the Community Scholarship Fund, receipt attached. She had paper-clipped a small piece of paper to the page. I looked at it. It was a copy of a withdrawal slip. The account number matched the shop's community fund account. The handwriting on the withdrawal slip was not Dorothy's, and it was not mine. I turned pages slowly. Each entry was the same date, amount, documentation, brief description. No emotional language, no accusations, pure record. Dorothy had understood that feelings do not hold up in a court of law, but receipts do. I was perhaps a third of the way through the notebook when I found the entry I was not prepared for. It was dated 3 years ago. Dorothy had written, "Marcus came by the shop on Tuesday while Rue was at the warehouse. I found scratch paper in the back room waste bin. He had been practicing Rue's signature. 12 or 15 attempts on a single sheet of paper. I recognized what I was looking at. I took the paper. It is folded inside the back cover of this notebook. I did not tell Rue. His pressure was high that month, and I was not going to put this in front of him until I had something complete enough to be useful. I am sorry for that, Roosevelt. I want you to know I was never keeping this from you to protect myself. I was keeping it from you to protect your heart until the time was right. The time is right now." I sat down on the stool behind the counter. The lamp made a small, warm circle on the surface in front of me. Outside, 79th Street had gone dark and quiet the way it did on weeknights after 9, when the foot traffic thinned and the neighborhood pulled itself inward against the cold. I reached to the back cover of the notebook and found the folded piece of paper Dorothy had described. I opened it. 12 attempts at my signature in my son's handwriting, each one a little more accurate than the last, marching down the page like a man rehearsing a lie until it felt like the truth. I sat with that paper in my hands for a long time. The ache in my chest was not from the surgery. I sat on that stool for a long time before I picked the notebook back up. Long enough for the lamp to feel warm against my arm. Long enough for the sounds of 79th Street outside to go from the thin, weeknight traffic of late evening to the deeper quiet of the hours past 10. I had been awake since 5:30 that morning, had ridden home from the hospital, had stood in my father's shop, and received the worst news of my adult life from my only son. Had found a hidden safe and my dead wife's final instructions, and had just held in my hands the evidence that my son had spent years practicing how to forge my name. I was tired in a way that sleep would not fix, but I opened the notebook again because Dorothy had asked me to, and because Dorothy had never once in 53 years asked me to do something that was not worth doing. She had organized the entries chronologically, oldest first, and she had been precise in a way that I recognized from watching her work for decades. Each entry had a date, a dollar amount, or a description of the specific harm, and a notation of what documentation she had attached, or where it could be found. The entries in the first quarter of the notebook covered a period beginning 8 years ago and running forward in careful increments. The Community Scholarship Fund appeared 3 times across that early period, a total of $9,000, removed in amounts small enough not to trigger an automatic review. Dorothy had attached photocopies of the withdrawal slips to the relevant pages. Each one bore the same studied imitation of my signature that I had just spent an hour analyzing on the foreclosure documents. There were other entries that had nothing to do with the shop's accounts directly. A personal loan Marcus had asked us for 4 years ago, $6,000, which he had told us was to cover a gap in his business operating expenses during a slow quarter. Dorothy had written beneath the entry, verified with his accountant, who confirmed there was no slow quarter. The business showed a profit that period. The money went to settle a gambling debt with a private individual in Evanston. She had attached a copy of a text message printed on plain paper between Marcus and a number she had labeled only as the creditor. The message from Marcus read, "I'll have it by the end of the month. My father doesn't know. He won't find out." I set that page down and picked it up again and set it down a second time. I turned more pages. The entries grew more complex as they moved forward in time. Marcus had used the shop's name on at least 2 occasions to establish credit with local suppliers, drawn down those credit lines, and then allowed them to lapse into collections that Dorothy had quietly settled before they could reach my desk. She had written the amounts in her careful columns, 7,000 here, 4,000 there. She had written beside one entry, "I paid this from my personal savings account." I did not tell Roosevelt. His blood pressure was elevated that month, and his doctor had specifically asked us to minimize stress. I will make a note of this repayment in case it ever becomes relevant. I sat with that sentence for a while. My wife had spent her personal savings cleaning up the damage our son was doing, and had filed the receipts in a hidden notebook behind a mirror in a barber shop, because she did not want to worry me. I was perhaps 2/3 of the way through the notebook when I encountered the name for the first time. The entry was dated 2 years ago, roughly 18 months before Dorothy passed. She had written, "Marcus met with a man named Victor Hale, representing a company called Meridian Capital, at a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue. I observed this meeting from across the room. I was not following Marcus. I was meeting a client 2 blocks away, and recognized him as I passed the window. I sat down where I could watch without being seen. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Hale did most of the talking. Marcus took notes on his phone. They shook hands when it was over, and Marcus looked pleased in the way he looks when he believes he has arranged something to his advantage. I do not yet know what was discussed. I intend to find out. She had written below that in slightly different ink, as though added later. I was not able to determine the full nature of the arrangement before I became ill. What I know is that Hale's company has acquired 4 commercial properties on the South Side in the past 18 months. All 4 were owned by black families. All 4 transfers occurred within 6 months of the owner experiencing a significant health event. I have included what documentation I was able to gather in the large envelope. Rue, I believe this is larger than Marcus.
I believe you need to understand that before you decide what to do.
I closed the notebook on that page and pressed my palm flat against the cover. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear it moving against the front window of the shop. That low, persistent pressure that comes off the lake in October and does not let up until April. I sat in the small circle of lamplight in my father's shop and thought about my wife spending the last years of her life gathering evidence that she never got to deliver in person. Then I remembered the last page. I had noticed it when I first opened the notebook, a page near the back that had a narrow strip of tape running along its top edge, sealing it to the inside back cover. Dorothy had written on the tape in her small, neat print, "Read this, last, Roosevelt, not before." I touched the tape with one finger, and then I took my hand away. She had asked me to read it last. I was going to read it last. I set the notebook on the counter beside the lamp and reached for the thick manila envelope instead, and the October wind pressed against the window, and the barber pole outside made its slow, faithful turn in the dark. The manila envelope was heavier than I expected. I set it on the counter and worked the metal clasp open carefully, the way you open something you understand to be important, and drew out the contents in a single stack. The paper was different from the foreclosure documents Marcus had brought. This was heavier stock, the kind used for formal legal instruments, and the letterhead at the top of the first page belonged to a law firm I did not recognize. Monroe and Associates, Community Legal Services, Southside, Chicago. The document itself was dated 3 years ago, approximately 2 years before Dorothy passed, and it was titled at the top in plain capital letters, Declaration of Historic Preservation Trust. I put my reading glasses back on, and I began to read. Dorothy had always said that the most powerful thing a person could own was not property or money, but a well-constructed document. She had said it so many times over the years that it had become something I smiled at rather than truly listened to, the way you stop hearing the things people closest to you say most often. Reading that trust document in the small hours of the morning in my father's barber shop, I understood for the first time that she had not been speaking in generalities. She had been describing what she was building. The document established Washington's barbershop, the physical structure, and the business operating within it, as a protected historic property under the Chicago Historic Preservation Framework. It named 5 trustees: Attorney Cheryl Monroe, Pastor Dwight Coleman of Greater Harvest Baptist Church, and 3 elder members of the surrounding community, whose names I recognized as men and women who had been part of this neighborhood since before I was born. The operational clauses were written in language that was precise to the point of being surgical. No sale transfer mortgage lien or encumbrance of any kind could be executed against the property or the business without the written consent of a majority of the trust's board of trustees. No power of attorney, whether general or specific, granted by either Roosevelt Washington or any future owner of record, could supersede or override the authority of the trust. I read that clause 3 times. Dorothy had not simply protected the shop from outside buyers. She had protected it from anyone acting on my behalf without the trust's knowledge, which meant she had protected it from exactly what Marcus had attempted to do. The mortgage Marcus had signed with Meridian Capital was not merely voidable. It was void from the moment it was executed, because the authority he had used to sign it had never legally existed. I turned to the final page of the trust document. At the bottom, below the notary seal and the witness signatures, Dorothy had paperclipped a plain white business card. Cheryl Monroe, Attorney at Law, Monroe and Associates. Beneath the printed text, Dorothy had written in her own hand, in the same small, neat print she had used on the sealed page of the notebook. She has been briefed. She is expecting your call. Do not wait. I turned the card over. On the back, Dorothy had written a cell phone number, and beneath it, underlined twice, "Call her, first Roosevelt, before anyone else." I set the card on the counter beside the lamp and looked at it for a moment. My wife had spent the last years of her life not only gathering evidence and building legal structures, but also identifying and briefing the specific attorney she wanted me to use when the time came. She had left me a loaded weapon and a set of instructions, and the name of the person who would help me aim it. It was somewhere past 5 in the morning by then. The darkness outside the front window had shifted from the deep black of midnight to the particular flat gray that comes just before dawn in October, when the sky is not yet light, but has stopped being fully dark. I was running on no sleep and the particular focused energy that comes when your mind has decided that rest is less important than understanding. I had been a wholesale food logistics manager for 30 years. I had learned in that work that the most dangerous thing you could do in a crisis was move before you fully understood the terrain. I understood the terrain now. The shop was protected. The mortgage was void. Marcus had committed forgery across multiple documents, and somewhere in the overlap between my son's actions and a company called Meridian Capital was a pattern that Dorothy had identified 18 months before she died and had not been able to fully document before her illness took her ability to do so. I was reaching for Cheryl Monroe's card when my phone vibrated against the countertop. The sound of it in the silence of the shop was loud enough to make me pull my hand back. I looked at the screen. 5:49 in the morning. Marcus. I looked at his name on the screen for a long moment. It was too early for a casual call. It was too early for anything that was not urgent, which meant that somewhere between yesterday afternoon and 5:49 in the morning, something had shifted in my son's understanding of his situation, and he had decided that the appropriate response was to call his 64-year-old father before the sun came up. I picked up the phone. I did not say anything. I simply accepted the call and waited to hear what my son needed badly enough to reach out for at this hour, and outside the October dawn pressed gray and cold against the front window of my father's shop. Marcus did not say good morning. He did not ask how I was feeling after my first night back from the hospital. He launched directly into the middle of what he wanted to say, the way a man does when he has been rehearsing it for hours and cannot afford to lose momentum by observing normal courtesies. He said there was a situation developing with the Meridian paperwork. He said a title issue had come up that his contact at the company had flagged overnight. He said it was probably nothing, but that he needed me to sit tight and not make any calls or take any meetings until he had a chance to sort things out. He said all of this quickly, the words running together slightly at the edges, the way words do when the person saying them is managing something that is moving faster than they are comfortable with. I stood behind my father's counter in the gray pre-dawn light and listened and did not say anything at all. There is a particular kind of silence that is not passive. My father understood this. He used to say that the most powerful thing a man could do in a difficult conversation was to stop talking and let the other person hear the echo of their own words coming back to them. I had watched him do it 100 times in this shop, watched him go completely still while someone worked themselves toward a truth they had not intended to arrive at. I had learned it from him the way I learned everything useful in my life, by watching and waiting, and understanding that patience is not the absence of action, but the most disciplined form of it. I held that silence now and let Marcus keep talking. He said his contact at Meridian had mentioned something about a possible prior encumbrance on the property title. He said it had probably been there for years without anyone noticing. He said the important thing was that no one do anything to escalate the situation before his contact had a chance to review the documentation and determine the best path forward. He said the words "his contact" 3 times in 2 minutes, and each time he said them, I noted that he did not use the name Victor Hale, though I was entirely certain that was who he meant. He said that if anyone reached out to me directly, meaning any lawyers or anyone from the city, I should tell them I was not available and refer them back to him. He said this in a tone that was working very hard to sound like reasonable advice and was not quite getting there. I had what I needed,
Marcus's contacted Meridian had flagged a title issue overnight. That meant Victor Hale had known, or strongly suspected, that there was a prior claim on the property before he signed the mortgage agreement with Marcus. A legitimate lender who discovers a title problem after closing notifies the borrower and works through legal channels to resolve it. A lender who flags it privately to the borrower's son and asks him to keep the borrower from making calls does not do that because he is trying to protect anyone's interests except his own. Marcus had just confirmed, without intending to, that Hale had gone into this arrangement with his eyes open. That changed the nature of what had happened here considerably. I let Marcus finish. He ended with a request that sounded like an instruction, telling me again to sit tight and trust him to handle it. When he stopped talking, I said 4 words. I said, "I hear you, son." Then I ended the call. I set the phone on the counter and stood in the silence for a moment. Outside, the dawn was coming up properly now, the gray lightening to a pale, cold blue above the rooftops across the street. I picked up Cheryl Monroe's card and looked at it. 7 hours until a reasonable person could be expected to answer a phone call. I had 7 hours to think, and I intended to use them. I unlocked the front door and stepped outside onto the sidewalk. The cold hit me immediately. The particular cutting cold of a Southside October morning that has no interest in being gentle about itself. I stood in front of the shop and looked down 79th Street in both directions. The block was quiet at this hour, the storefronts dark behind their security gates, the sidewalk empty except for a man walking a dog half a block east who paid me no attention. I looked at the buildings on my side of the street, Washington's barber shop, then the dry cleaner, which had been there since the 80s, then the Gap where Mr. Tillman's hardware store used to be before it closed 2 years ago, then another Gap where the alterations shop had been before that closed 18 months ago, then the corner where the insurance office that had operated out of that space for 20 years had shut its doors last spring. 3 businesses gone in 2 years. I had mourned each one the way you mourn the slow changes in a neighborhood you have known your whole life, with a kind of tired resignation, telling myself it was the economy or the times or simply the way of things. I walked to the dry cleaner and looked at the gate on the hardware store space. There was a small printed notice in the lower corner of the darkened window, a property management notice. I leaned closer and read the company name in the pale early morning light. Meridian Capital Property Holdings. I straightened up and walked to the alterations shop space. Same notice, same name in the same corner. I did not need to walk to the corner to check the insurance office. I already knew what I would find. I stood on the sidewalk in the cold October morning outside my father's shop and looked at what Victor Hale had been building on this block while I was busy running a barber shop and trusting my son. And I understood for the first time the actual size of what Dorothy had been trying to warn me about. Dorothy always said that when you needed a lawyer, you needed to find one who had been fighting longer than the system had been finding new ways to be corrupt. She said it the way she said most important things, quietly and without elaboration, as though the wisdom was self-evident and the only question was whether you were paying enough attention to receive it. I had not fully understood what she meant until I walked into the third-floor office of Monroe & Associates on a Monday morning in October and shook the hand of Cheryl Monroe for the first time. The office was not large, and it was not decorated to impress. The walls held framed copies of significant civil rights rulings and a photograph of a block on the south side that I recognized as 63rd Street, taken sometime in the 1970s. The desk was broad and covered in organized work. There was no receptionist. Cheryl Monroe opened the door herself when I knocked, looked at me for 1 second, and said she had been expecting my call for longer than I knew. She was a compact woman in her early 50s, with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong moment costs someone everything. She did not offer condolences about Dorothy or ask how I was feeling after my surgery. She poured 2 cups of coffee from a carafe on the credenza, set one in front of me, and said, Tell me what happened. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out, because the things people think are too small to mention are usually the things that matter most. So I told her. I laid the green notebook and the manila envelope on her desk, and I talked for 40 minutes without stopping, from the foreclosure notice, to the forged signatures, to the trust document, to the 3 Meridian Capital notices on the storefronts down 79th Street. She listened without interrupting. She made notes on a yellow legal pad in a small, precise hand. When I finished, she picked up the notebook and read without speaking for several minutes. When she set it down, she took her reading glasses off her forehead and put them on, and picked up the trust document and read through the operational clauses. I watched her fingers stop on the paragraph about powers of attorney. She read it twice. Then she set the document down and looked at me over the rims of her glasses and said the mortgage Marcus executed with Meridian Capital was void at the moment of signing. Not voidable. Void. The trust document Dorothy established 3 years ago removed the legal capacity for anyone acting under a power of attorney to encumber this property. Marcus did not have the authority to sign that agreement because that authority did not exist. She said it without drama, the way a doctor reads a test result as simple fact, delivered clearly. Then she said, the forged signatures on the loan documents constitute criminal fraud. That is a separate matter from the civil question of the mortgage's validity, and it is a considerably more serious one. I told her about the call at 5:49 in the morning. I told her exactly what Marcus had said about his contact at Meridian flagging a title issue overnight, about being asked to keep me from making calls or taking meetings. Cheryl set her pen down and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she said, if Victor Hale knew about the prior trust encumbrance before he executed that mortgage, and the evidence suggests he did, then he did not enter into a bad faith agreement. He entered into a fraudulent one. She said the distinction mattered because bad faith was a civil matter, but fraud in a real estate transaction of this scale, particularly one involving a federally protected historic property, carried criminal implications that extended well beyond the family. She said she had been tracking Meridian Capital for 18 months. She said the pattern of acquisitions on the south side had not been random and had not been opportunistic. It had been systematic. She opened her desk drawer and produced a thin folder, which she laid on top of the trust documents. Inside were printed records of 14 property transfers, all within a 3-mile radius of Washington's barbershop, all completed within the past 2 years. Every property had previously been owned by a black family or a black-owned business. Every transfer had occurred within 8 months of the original owner experiencing a significant health event. Every transaction had involved a third-party intermediary from within the owner's family or close circle. She tapped the folder and said, "Your son is not the first. He is the most recent. And because Dorothy left what she left, he may be the last." I sat with that for a moment. Outside the third-floor window, the south side moved through its Monday morning, the street sounds coming up faint and ordinary, entirely indifferent to what was being decided in this room. Cheryl picked up her phone and dialed a number from memory. When the call connected, she identified herself by name and stated that she was calling on behalf of her client, Roosevelt Washington, regarding a disputed encumbrance on a property at the address of Washington's Barbershop on 79th Street, and that she was formally notifying the party of record that the mortgage instrument executed under that address was legally void, and that any further action toward foreclosure would be met with an immediate injunction and a full criminal referral to the Cook County State's Attorney. She listened for a moment, said she understood, and ended the call. She set the phone down and looked at me. She said, "They will call Marcus within the hour." I said that was fine. She said, "We are not losing that shop, Mr. Washington." I looked at her and felt something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with the surgery. A loosening of something that had been wound very tight since yesterday afternoon. I said, "No, we are not." The days after my first meeting with Cheryl Monroe had a different quality than the day that preceded them. The shock of Monday morning had burned itself out, and what remained in its place was something cooler, and more deliberate. The particular mental state I had learned to recognize in myself over 30 years of logistics work, when a situation had been fully assessed and the only remaining question was execution. Cheryl had asked me to give her 48 hours to build out the full scope of the case before we made any additional moves. I had agreed. I went back to the shop each morning, opened it for business, cut hair alongside Big E, and let the ordinary rhythms of 79th Street move around me, while my mind worked quietly in the background. There is something clarifying about the work of a barber shop, the repetition of it, the way it requires your hands to be present, even when your thoughts are elsewhere. My father had always said the shop kept him honest. I was beginning to understand what he meant. It was Big E who told me about Gerald Watkins. On the second morning after my meeting with Cheryl, Big E arrived early and sat in the back room with a cup of coffee, and told me that he had been thinking about something since the day Marcus and Tiffany had come into the shop. He said he had a friend named Gerald who had owned a shoe repair business 4 blocks north on Halsted for 22 years. Gerald had gone into the hospital with a cardiac event 14 months ago. His nephew had handled his affairs while he was recovering. By the time Gerald was well enough to ask questions, the building was gone, transferred to a holding company for 60 cents on the dollar, and the nephew had moved to Atlanta and was not returning calls. Big E said he had assumed it was a family tragedy, the kind of painful thing that happened sometimes, and had not thought much more about it until he heard Tiffany say the name Meridian Capital in the shop on Monday. He looked at me over his coffee cup and said it was Meridian that bought Gerald's building, Rue. I know because Gerald showed me the paperwork when he was trying to figure out if he had any options left. I called Cheryl from the back room and told her about Gerald Watkins. She said she already had his case in her files. She said she had 4 others as well. She said when I came in that afternoon, she wanted me to bring Big E because she had questions for him and because she believed his testimony about the Watkins transaction would be useful. I told her we would be there at 2 o'clock. Pastor Dwight Coleman was already in Cheryl's office when Big E and I arrived. He was a large man in his early 70s who had led Greater Harvest Baptist Church on this block for 30 years and who carried the particular authority of a man whom the neighborhood had trusted with its most private sorrows for 3 decades. He and I had known each other since we were young fathers, bringing our children to the same summer programs at the church. He stood when I came in and shook my hand and held it a moment longer than a regular handshake, the way men do when words are not sufficient. He said he was sorry about Dorothy. I thanked him. We sat down. Cheryl laid out the 14 cases across the conference table in chronological order. Each one had a folder with the property address, the original owner's name, the health event that had preceded the transfer, and the name of the family member or associate who had facilitated the transaction. The pattern was so consistent across 14 cases that it stopped looking like coincidence somewhere around the 4th folder and started looking like a process. Cheryl said that was because it was a process. She said Meridian Capital had a staff member whose sole documented function, based on incorporation records she had obtained, was described as community relationship development. She said that in practice, what that meant was identifying vulnerable property owners, locating cooperative family members, and managing the timeline from initial contact to completed transfer. Big E looked at the folders for a long time without speaking. Then he said quietly that Gerald Watkins had told him his nephew had been approached first before Gerald even went into the hospital. He said Gerald had always wondered how the nephew had known to call Meridian so quickly after the cardiac event. Now he understood. Pastor Coleman said that Victor Hale had come to him personally 14 months ago. He said Hale had presented himself as a community investor interested in partnering with anchor institutions on the South Side to develop mixed-use properties. He had offered the church a consulting fee in exchange for referrals to business owners in the congregation who might be interested in liquidity options for their commercial properties. Pastor Coleman said he had thanked Hale for his time and shown him out and had not thought about him again until Big E had called him 2 nights ago. He said, "I wish I had made some calls back then. I might have connected some of these dots sooner." Cheryl said, "You are connecting them now. That is what matters. Cheryl's phone rang while we were still sitting at the table. She looked at the screen and said it was a number registered to Meridian Capital's legal department. She answered it on speaker without asking our permission, which I appreciated. A man's voice came through, smooth and practiced, identifying himself as counsel from Meridian Capital and stating that his client was prepared to discuss a resolution that would be satisfactory to all parties. He used the phrase, mutually beneficial outcome, twice in 30 seconds. He said Meridian was prepared to forgive the outstanding loan balance in full and provide an additional payment of $25,000 in exchange for a full release of any claims and a confidentiality agreement. Cheryl looked at me across the table. The room was very quiet. I looked back at her and shook my head once. She said into the phone, "My client declines." She said it the way she said most things, without elaboration, and ended the call. There is a moment when a man stops grieving and starts deciding. I have heard people describe it different ways over the years, sitting in the chairs of this shop, men talking the way men talk when the clippers are running and the mirrors are fogged and the room feels private enough for honesty. Some describe it as anger. Some describe it as clarity. One man, a retired postal worker named Herbert, who came in every 2 weeks for 40 years until his knees gave out, once described it as the moment you stop asking why and start asking what next. I found mine at 2 in the morning on the 4th night after I came home from the hospital, sitting in my father's barber chair in the dark, with the shop closed around me, and the October wind pressing against the front window, and the green notebook lying open on the counter where I had left it. I had not planned to sit in my father's chair. I had come back to the shop after leaving Cheryl's office because I could not sleep in the house, which felt too large and too quiet in a way it had not felt before Dorothy died. The shop was smaller and older and carried more of her in it somehow. The lamp she had chosen, the mirror she had hung, the particular smell of the cedar cabinets she had polished every first Saturday of the month for 30 years. I had sat in the waiting chairs for a while, and then I had moved without entirely deciding to my father's station. His chair was the one on the left, the original, the one he had ordered from a supplier in Indianapolis in 1970, and assembled himself on the floor of this space before the walls were even painted. I had reupholstered it twice over the decades, but the frame was original. It still had the particular way of settling under a person's weight that my father's chairs always had, as though they were designed not just to hold a body, but to hold it still long enough for the person in it to hear themselves think. I sat there and I thought about my son. Not the man who had stood in this shop 4 days ago in his expensive jacket and explained in a measured voice how he had used my name and my father's legacy to borrow money he had no legal right to borrow. I thought about the boy, Marcus at 7 years old, sitting in this same chair, getting his first real haircut, his legs too short to reach the footrest, his eyes tracking everything in the room with the particular bright attention of a child who is cataloging the world as fast as it is being revealed to him. Marcus, at 12, sweeping the floor on Saturday mornings for $5 and a lecture from my father about the relationship between work and dignity. Marcus, at 17. The weekend he told me he wanted to be a lawyer because he had watched me get shortchanged on a business contract and decided that someone in the family needed to understand how documents worked. I had been so proud of that. I had told Dorothy that same night, and she had smiled and said, "Make sure he learns what documents are for, not just how to use them." At some point in his life, Marcus had learned how to use them without learning what they were for. I did not know exactly when that had happened, or whether there was a single moment I could point to and say, there, that was the turn. I had spent 4 days trying to locate that moment, and I had not found it. What I had found instead, sitting in my father's chair at 2 in the morning, was something Dorothy had written near the middle of the notebook in an entry from 2 years ago. She had written, "I have spent a long time asking myself where we went wrong with Himru. I have decided that is the wrong question. The right question is what we do now. Because Marcus is not lost, he is not broken beyond repair, but he will not find his way back on his own, and he will not find it through our silence. The kindest thing we can do for him, the thing that actually looks like love instead of just feeling like it, is to let the consequences find him. She had underlined the last sentence. I had read it 3 times before I closed the notebook. I understood what she was telling me. I had understood it from the first time I read it. The difficulty was not comprehension. The difficulty was that the man she was describing, the man who could let the consequences find his own son, was not a man I had ever had occasion to be before. I had spent 42 years finding ways to soften the consequences for Marcus, catching him before he fell, filling the gaps he left, absorbing the costs he generated. I had done it because I loved him, and because that is what fathers do, and because my own father had done the same for me when I was young and foolish in my own particular ways. But my father had also known when to step back. He had told me once, cutting my hair in this chair when I was in my 30s and complaining about a business dispute, that the hardest thing a man ever does is stand still and let someone he loves walk into something painful, because the pain is the only thing that will teach them what they need to know. I had thought I understood that at the time. I had not understood it at all. I picked up my phone from the counter at 2:17 in the morning and I called Big E. He answered on the second ring without any grogginess in his voice, which told me he had not been sleeping either. I said, "Big E, Saturday morning, I need everybody in the shop." He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "How many people are we talking about, Rue?" I said, "Everybody who has ever had a reason to care about this place." He was quiet again for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had that particular quality it got when he had made up his mind about something, low and settled and completely certain. He said, "I'll make the calls, every last one of them." I said thank you and ended the call and sat in my father's chair in the dark for a while longer, listening to the wind and the distant sound of the city and the particular silence of a place that has been full of human life for long enough that it never goes entirely quiet. Cheryl Monroe did not practice law the way I had seen lawyers work in movies or on television, which was to say, she did not pace, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not appear to experience urgency as an emotion. What she experienced it as far as I could tell from watching her work across 2 full days in her 3rd-floor office, was fuel. The more complex the situation became, the more completely she settled into it, the way a good mechanic settles into a difficult engine, with total attention and no wasted motion. Her assistant, a young woman named Priya, who could not have been more than 25, and who moved through the office with the focused energy of someone who understood that the work they were doing mattered, produced documents and made calls, and organized files with an efficiency that reminded me of Dorothy in her prime. By the morning of the 5th day, after I had come home from the hospital, the conference table in Cheryl's office was covered in 4 distinct piles of paper, each one representing a separate legal theory, and Cheryl was moving between them with a yellow marker and a certainty that I found genuinely steadying. She laid out the criminal exposure from Marcus first because it was the most straightforward. Forgery of a legal instrument, 3 counts, 1 for each document bearing the fabricated signature. Fraud in a real estate transaction, 1 count, based on the execution of a mortgage against a property he had no legal authority to encumber. Misappropriation of funds, multiple counts, drawn from Dorothy's documentation of the withdrawals from the community scholarship account and the shop's operating accounts over the preceding 8 years. She said the forgery counts alone carried a sentencing range that would significantly affect any plea negotiation. She said the fraud count, given the dollar amount involved and the involvement of a federally recognized historic property, elevated the matter to a level that would draw the attention of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office without much difficulty. She said all of this without satisfaction and without apology, the way a doctor describes a diagnosis as information that a person needed to have in order to make informed decisions about what came next. The exposure for Victor Hale was more complex, but ultimately more serious. Cheryl had spent the better part of 2 days building the predatory lending case from the 14 property files. And what had emerged from that work was a pattern of conduct that went beyond opportunism into something that had a name under federal statute. She said the systematic targeting of vulnerable property owners, the use of planted intermediaries, and the deliberate structuring of loan terms designed to trigger default constituted a violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act at a level that the Department of Justice had successfully prosecuted in comparable cases in other cities. She said that was the civil exposure. The criminal exposure was different, and it had come from a source she had not anticipated. She opened a folder and slid it across the table to me. Inside were 3 printed pages, each one a reproduction of an internal email chain from within Meridian Capital's corporate communications. She said the Illinois Attorney General's office had been building its own parallel investigation and had obtained these documents through a subpoena to Meridian's email server 6 weeks ago. The AG's investigator had contacted Cheryl 2 days earlier after seeing her formal notice to Meridian and recognizing the Washington case as the strongest individual instance of the pattern they had been documenting. The emails were between Victor Hale and 2 of his associates, dated approximately 2 years ago. I read through them carefully. The first email identified Washington's barbershop by address and described it as a priority acquisition target due to its anchor position on the block and the owner's age and recent health history. The second email, sent 3 weeks later, contained a single line that I read twice to make sure I had understood it correctly. Hale had written, "The Washington kid is ready. He'll sign whatever we need. Had dinner with him Tuesday. He thinks this is his idea." I set the pages down on the table. The shop had been a target before Marcus ever approached Meridian. Hale had identified the property, identified my son as a potential instrument, and cultivated him deliberately over a period of months until Marcus believed he was acting on his own initiative. My son had not simply made a terrible choice in a moment of weakness. He had been located, assessed, and recruited by a man who made his living knowing exactly which doors a person's greed would open if you knocked on them the right way. That did not absolve Marcus of what he had done. Nothing was going to do that. But it added a dimension to the situation that I had not fully accounted for, and I sat with it for a moment before I looked back up at Cheryl. She said the email chain established wire fraud at the federal level because the recruitment of Marcus and the subsequent financial transactions had been conducted across state lines using electronic communication. She said federal wire fraud in connection with a systematic predatory lending operation of this scale was the kind of case that the FBI's Financial Crimes Division took an active interest in. She said she had already been in contact with an agent she knew from a previous case, and that the agent had expressed significant interest in the Meridian files. She said, "We have everything we need." She looked at me across the table and said, "I want to file Saturday morning, right before you open the shop. I want Marcus to walk in there thinking he is coming to witness the end of something, and I want him to find out instead that it is the beginning of the end of him." I looked back at her and said then, "That is what we will do." My father used to say that when the weight got too heavy to carry standing still, you picked up your tools and you worked. He said it was not avoidance. He said it was the opposite of avoidance. He said that a man who works with his hands while his mind is troubled is not running from his trouble, but inviting it to sit beside him where he can see it clearly. Because there's something about the discipline of physical work that strips a problem down to its actual size and shape and removes the distortions that fear and exhaustion add to it in the dark hours. I had heard him say this many times in the shop over many years, and I had believed it in the abstract, the way you believe things your father tells you before you have had enough life experience to test them properly. On the Friday evening before the last Saturday that Washington's barbershop would ever be in danger of belonging to anyone other than the Washington family, I finally understood what he meant. I had closed the shop at 6 and sent Big E home and stood alone behind my station for a long time before I reached for the clippers. The set I used was the same model I had been using for 20 years, a professional-grade tool with a cord that had been replaced twice and a blade that I kept sharp enough to split a hair lengthwise. I had not picked them up since before the surgery. The doctors had not specifically prohibited it, but the recovery instructions had said to avoid fine motor tasks that required sustained grip strength for the first several weeks, and I had followed that instruction with the particular obedience of a man who has recently had his chest opened and has developed a new and specific respect for medical advice. But the surgery was 6 weeks behind me now, and Cheryl had filed the criminal complaint that afternoon, and tomorrow morning, everything was going to change, and I needed to be in my hands tonight more than I needed to be careful. I plugged in the clippers and turned them on, and the familiar vibration moved up through my palm and into my wrist, and I stood at my station and worked on the dress form I kept behind the counter for practicing new techniques, and the sound of the blades and the feeling of the tool in my hand did exactly what my father had said it would do. The noise of the past week began to organize itself into something manageable. The grief and the anger and the exhaustion and the cold, deliberate satisfaction of watching Cheryl build a case that Dorothy had spent years laying the foundation for. All of it sorted itself into its proper proportions, while my hands moved and the clippers ran, and the shop held itself around me the way it had held every difficult thing I had ever brought into it for 64 years. I heard the knock at the back door at 7:30. 3 knocks, measured and unhurried, the kind of knock that belongs to someone who is not uncertain about whether they will be let in. I turned off the clippers and went to the back and opened the door, and Pastor Dwight Coleman stood in the alley in his coat with his hands in his pockets, his breath making small clouds in the cold October air. He said he hoped he was not disturbing me. I told him there was coffee on and held the door open, and he came inside and we sat in the back room at the small table where Big E and I ate lunch on days when neither of us felt like going out. And I poured 2 cups, and we sat with them for a moment without talking, which was one of the things I had always valued about Dwight Coleman. He understood that silence between 2 people who trust each other is not empty. He asked me how I was holding up. I told him honestly that I did not entirely know yet that I had been moving fast enough for the past 5 days that I had not had time to take a full accounting of where I actually was. He nodded and looked at his coffee cup, and then he looked at me and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Are you doing this for justice or for revenge?" He said it gently, without accusation, the way a man asks a question when he genuinely wants to know the answer rather than prove a point. I was quiet for a moment. The question deserved the thought he had asked me to give it. I turned it over and examined it from several angles, the way Dorothy had taught me to examine any question that made me uncomfortable. Because she always said, the questions that make you want to answer quickly are the ones that most need you to answer slowly. I told him that I was doing it because Dorothy had asked me to, and because every man in the neighborhood had a right to know what had almost happened to them and what was still happening to the families that had already lost their properties to Meridian Capital. I told him that if Marcus came through this with something left to build on, I hoped he would build something honest, and that I was not doing this to destroy him, but because the only path to anything real for him now ran straight through the consequences of what he had chosen. Pastor Coleman listened to all of it, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "James would be proud of you, son." He said it simply, and he meant it, and it landed in my chest in a place that had been empty since my father died 18 years ago. We finished our coffee, and he told me he would be at the shop at 8 in the morning, and I walked him to the back door and watched him move down the alley into the cold, dark. I went back through to the front of the shop and turned off the lamp behind the counter. The front window was dark, and I stood at it for a moment, looking out at 79th Street. The block was quiet in the way it got on Friday nights, after the early crowd had gone home and before the later one arrived. A car I did not recognize was parked directly across the street, dark-colored engine off, no visible occupant. It had been there when I arrived that morning. It was still there now. I stood at the window and looked at it for a long moment. Then I pulled the security gate across the front door and locked it, and went home to get what sleep I could before Saturday came. Saturday morning at Washington's barber shop had looked the same for 53 years. That was not an exaggeration or a sentiment. It was a fact that could be verified by anyone who had lived within 6 blocks of 79th Street since 1971. The chairs filled early. The conversation ran loud and layered, 4 or 5 threads going at once. Sports and politics and neighborhood business, and the particular kind of philosophical argument that only happens between men who have known each other long enough to disagree without damage. The smell of pomade and fresh coffee, and the specific warm air of a room full of people who belong to each other, settled over everything like a weather system. My father had built that Saturday morning the way a musician builds a song, one instrument at a time, over years, and it had outlasted him by 18 years and showed no signs of stopping. This Saturday was different in one respect. By 7:45, every chair along the waiting wall was filled, and men were standing 3 deep along the side wall and spilling into the back room, and not one of them had come for a haircut. Big E had made his calls on Tuesday night and Wednesday morning, and the calls had traveled the way calls travel in a neighborhood that has been paying attention to itself for half a century, moving from man to man along the lines of 30 years of Saturday mornings and church pews and block association meetings, and the 100 other structures through which a community keeps track of its own. They had come because Big E had asked them to come, and because Big E did not ask for things without reason. Pastor Coleman sat in the front row of waiting chairs with his coat folded across his knees and his hands resting on top of it, still and composed, the way he was in church before the service started. Gerald Watkins was there, his cane hooked over the arm of his chair. Men I had cut hair for since they were boys, and men whose fathers I had cut hair for before them, lined the walls and stood in the back, and waited with the particular patience of people who understand that some things cannot be rushed. I was in the back room when I heard the bell above the front door ring at 8:12. I had been there since 6, had made the coffee, and unlocked the cases and set the green notebook on the counter beside the register where I could reach it, and had changed into the apron. Not my apron, my father's. The original white cotton with the shop name embroidered across the chest in the same dark green as the sign outside, worn thin at the pockets from decades of use, and washed so many times it had taken on the particular softness of something that has been cared for consistently over a very long time. I had found it on the hook behind the backroom door where it had hung since my father retired, and I had put it on without entirely deciding, to the way I had sat in his chair without deciding to, because some decisions make themselves when the time is right. I heard Marcus's voice before I saw him. He was talking as he came through the door, mid-sentence addressing someone on his phone, and I heard the particular confident cadence he used when he was performing competence for an audience. Then I heard the cadence change. I heard it shift into something shorter and more careful, and I understood that he had registered the room. I came through from the back and stood at my station and looked at my son standing in the doorway of my father's shop, with his wife behind him, and a man I did not recognize beside him, a younger man in a gray suit carrying a leather portfolio, who had the careful eyes of someone who had been sent to watch and report rather than to participate. Marcus looked at the room. He looked at Pastor Coleman in the front row. He looked at Gerald Watkins with his cane. He looked at the men standing along the walls. He looked at me in my father's apron behind the counter. Something moved across his face that he controlled quickly, but not quickly enough. Tiffany stepped in behind him and stopped. She looked at the assembled room with an expression that cycled through confusion and irritation, and something that might, in a person with more experience of consequences, have been the early edge of understanding. She said Marcus's name in a low, sharp voice. He put his hand up slightly without looking at her, a gesture so automatic it told me everything about the architecture of their marriage. The man with the portfolio stepped to the side near the door and opened it, and took out a document and held it in both hands. And I understood that Victor Hale had sent his own representation to witness what he expected would be an uncontested handover. Cheryl Monroe stood up from the chair in the far corner where she had been sitting since 7:30, invisible to anyone who was not looking for her. She was wearing a dark suit and carrying a slim briefcase. And she walked to the center of the room with the unhurried certainty of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how it ends. The man with the portfolio saw her, and his posture changed. Marcus saw her and went very still. Cheryl said good morning to the room. Then she addressed the man with the portfolio directly and informed him that she was counsel for Roosevelt Washington and the Washington's Barbershop Historic Preservation Trust, and that she had a court order requiring Marcus Washington to remain present on the premises to receive formal legal notification of pending criminal proceedings. She said it pleasantly and without emphasis, the way you read a weather report. The man with the portfolio looked at the document she produced, and then looked at Marcus, and then looked at his portfolio and did not say anything. I reached under the counter and picked up the green notebook. The room had gone completely quiet. 30 men and the accumulated weight of 53 years of Saturday mornings held their breath in my father's shop, and I stood behind the counter in my father's apron and looked at my son and said, "Sit down, Marcus. There are some things these men need to hear." My wife had a gift. It was not a mysterious gift or a dramatic one. It was the gift of paying attention in a sustained and disciplined way over a very long period of time, of watching the people she loved with the particular quality of attention that most people reserve for strangers they are trying to figure out and rarely extend to the people they already believe they know. She had watched Marcus for 42 years with that attention. She had watched him the way she kept her accounts, carefully and without sentiment, recording what was actually there rather than what she hoped or feared to find. The green notebook in my hands was the record of that watching. I opened it to the first page, and I read the date aloud, and the room stayed quiet. And I began. I did not read every word of every entry. There were too many, and the room did not need every detail to understand what Dorothy had documented. What I read was the shape of it, the dates and the amounts, and the specific nature of each harm moving through the years in the order Dorothy had recorded them. The Community Scholarship Fund. 3 withdrawals across 14 months, totaling $9,000. The credit lines opened in the shop's name and drawn down and abandoned. The personal loan of $6,000 that had gone to settle a gambling debt rather than stabilize a business. The forged withdrawal slips with their careful imitation of my signature. I read it the way Dorothy had written it, without editorial comment, as plain record, because plain record was what the room needed. And because Dorothy had understood that the truth does not require decoration to be devastating. About halfway through, a man in the third row made a sound. It was not a loud sound. It was the kind of involuntary sound a person makes when something they are hearing connects to something they already know, and the connection is painful. His name was Robert Elkins, and he had been coming to this shop since his son was 3 years old, and his son was now 22 and had applied for the community scholarship 3 years ago and had not received it, despite being one of the stronger candidates that year. Robert had always assumed the committee had simply chosen someone else. He looked at the notebook in my hands, and then he looked at Marcus, and then he looked back at the notebook, and the sound he made was quiet, and it carried the particular weight of a man understanding something he had been carrying without knowing what it was. 2 other men in the room shifted in their chairs when Robert made that sound, which told me their sons had applied that same year. Marcus had not moved from the chair Big E had quietly directed him to when he first sat down. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and he was looking at the floor between his feet. Tiffany had stopped moving at some point in the past several minutes and was sitting very still with her purse in her lap. Her earlier impatience entirely replaced by something that looked on her face deeply uncomfortable. The man with the portfolio from Meridian was standing near the back of the room and had not said a word since Cheryl had produced the court order. I had almost forgotten he was there. I reached the entry about the Michigan Avenue meeting, Dorothy's careful description of watching Marcus shake hands with Victor Hale and leave looking pleased with himself. I read it without commentary and without looking up from the page. Then I read the section Dorothy had added later, her analysis of the Meridian acquisition pattern, her conclusion that what Marcus had walked into was not an opportunity, but a recruitment. I read the line she had written at the end of that entry. I believe this is larger than Marcus. I believe you need to understand that before you decide what to do. I closed the notebook on that page and set it on the counter and looked at the room. 30 men looked back at me. The October morning light came through the front window and lay across the floor of my father's shop in long, pale rectangles. And nobody said anything. Cheryl Monroe stepped forward. She had a laptop open on her arm, and she turned it toward the wall above the mirror Dorothy had hung, where she had placed a small, portable projector on a shelf before anyone arrived. The image that appeared on the wall was a reproduced email chain, the text large enough to read from the back of the room. 3 emails between Victor Hale and 2 associates. The first identifying Washington's barbershop as a priority acquisition target. The second noting my age and recent health history. The third, the one I had read in Cheryl's office 2 days ago, projected now onto the wall of my father's shop in letters large enough for 30 men to read simultaneously. The Washington kid is ready. He'll sign whatever we need. Had dinner with him Tuesday. He thinks this is his idea. The room was absolutely still for a moment. Then Robert Elkins said quietly and without any particular heat, "The particular kind of thing a man says when the last piece of a picture falls into place, and the picture is worse than he thought it was going to be." Several other men in the room said nothing, but shifted their weight in a way that communicated the same thing. Marcus raised his head and looked at the wall, and then looked at his hands, and did not look up again. In the corner of my vision, I saw the man with the portfolio from Meridian very quietly begin moving toward the door. Cheryl had anticipated the man with the portfolio. I understood this when I saw that the back door of the shop, the door that opened onto the alley, was already blocked by a uniformed officer who had been standing there since before 8 o'clock. The man with the portfolio reached the front door and opened it and found 2 more officers on the sidewalk outside and a detective in a dark jacket who introduced himself by name and asked him very politely to step back inside. He stepped back inside. Cheryl crossed the room and spoke briefly with the detective and handed him a document from her briefcase, and the detective read it and nodded and said something to the officers, and they came in, and the room rearranged itself around this new development with the particular quiet efficiency of people who had known something like this was coming and had been waiting for it to arrive. Justice in our neighborhood has not always come from courthouses. I say that not as a complaint, but as a fact of history that every man in that room understood without needing it explained. The South Side had not always been a place where the official instruments of the law could be trusted to move in the direction of people who looked like us. And that history lived in the room, the way all true history lives. Not as a distant thing, but as a present awareness that shaped how people held their bodies and what they expected when authority walked through a door. What was different about this Saturday morning was that the authority walking through the door had been built and directed by a woman from this neighborhood who had spent 30 years making sure it pointed the right way. The men along the walls understood that. I could see it in how they held themselves, not with tension, but with a kind of watchful recognition, the look of people witnessing something they had wanted to see for a long time and were making sure to remember correctly. The detective approached Marcus. He said his name, and then he said the names of the charges: forgery, real estate fraud, misappropriation of funds. And he said them in a level, professional voice that gave each word its proper weight, without adding anything to it. Marcus stood up from the chair slowly. He looked at the detective, and then he looked at me, and his face in that moment was not the face of the man who had stood in this shop 6 days ago, in his expensive jacket, explaining his decisions with the patience of someone who expected to be deferred to. It was younger than that face. It was a face I had not seen since he was a boy, uncertain and looking for something to hold on to, and finding nothing. He did not say anything. He put his hands behind his back when the detective asked him to, and the handcuffs went on with a sound that was very small in the quiet room and very permanent. Tiffany stood up from her chair. She had been still for so long that her sudden movement startled the man next to her. She said Marcus's name in a voice that was too loud for the room and too unsteady to carry the authority she was trying to put into it. She moved toward him, and one of the officers stepped into her path, not aggressively, but firmly, and she stopped. She looked at Marcus in the handcuffs, and then she looked at me, and the expression on her face went through several things in rapid succession before it settled into something that was not grief and was not remorse, but was the specific shock of a person whose understanding of how the world works has just been revised in a direction they find entirely unacceptable. She said that this was not over. She said it to the room generally, to me specifically, to anyone who would register it. An older woman named Miss Aurelia, who had been sitting in the back corner since 7:30, and who had been a fixture of this block for 60 years, and who had lost her own business to a predatory loan in 1989, reached out and put her hand briefly on Tiffany's arm, and said quietly and without unkindness, "Child, it is very much over." Tiffany looked at her and did not say anything else. Cheryl's phone buzzed once. She looked at it and said to me, "They have Hale." The FBI team had gone to Meridian Capital's offices in the Loop at 8 o'clock that morning, simultaneous with the filing of the criminal complaint, and Victor Hale had been at his desk when they arrived. The man with the portfolio, who had provided his name to the detective and was now sitting in a chair near the door, looking at his hands, received this information through whatever notification system his employer used, and his face went a particular color that had nothing to do with the October morning light coming through the front window. The officers walked Marcus toward the front door of the shop. The room opened a path for them the way water opens for a stone, not with hostility, but with the simple physical fact of people moving aside. Marcus walked through his grandfather's shop in handcuffs, past the photographs on the wall, past the framed image of James Washington on opening day in 1971, past the faces of 53 years of neighborhood men and boys who had sat in these chairs and told the truth about their lives. I stood behind my father's counter in my father's apron, and I watched my son walk out of the shop, and I did not say anything, and I did not look away. The bell above the door rang its 2-note chime as they went through the same sound it had made 10,000 times before, and the door swung shut, and the room breathed again, and 79th Street received the morning like any other morning, and kept moving. The men left slowly, the way men leave a place where something significant has happened, not in a rush, but in a gradual dispersal, pausing at the door to shake hands or say a few words. The particular unhurried exit of people who understand that what they have witnessed deserves a moment of acknowledgement before the ordinary world resumes. Pastor Coleman was the last to go. He stood at the door for a moment and looked at me across the empty shop and said that Dorothy would have appreciated the way it went, and that he meant that as the highest compliment he knew how to give. I told him I understood and thanked him for being there, and he went out into the October afternoon, and the door swung shut behind him, and I was alone in my father's shop for the first time since the morning had begun. I spent some time doing the ordinary things. I folded the chairs back against the wall. I washed the coffee cups in the backroom sink. I took off my father's apron and hung it carefully on its hook behind the backroom door, smoothing it flat the way I imagined he had smoothed it every evening for 30 years. The projector Cheryl had set up came down from the shelf and went back into its case. I wiped down the counter and straightened the photographs on the wall, 2 of which had been jostled slightly by the movement of 30 bodies in a room not designed for 30 bodies. I worked slowly and without urgency, the way you do when the thing you have been moving toward for days has finally arrived, and the momentum that carried you here has gently run its course, and what is left is simply the quiet work of returning a space to itself. The green notebook was still on the counter where I had set it after reading from it that morning. I had closed it on the Michigan Avenue entry and set it down, and it had stayed there through everything that followed, through the handcuffs and Tiffany's voice and the bell above the door and the long, slow emptying of the room. I picked it up now and held it for a moment. The cloth spine was worn soft from handling, and the brass clasp had the particular warmth of metal that has been touched many times. I turned it over in my hands, and then I opened it to the back and found the sealed page. The strip of tape Dorothy had used was narrow and neat, pressed flat along the top edge of the final page, with the precision she brought to everything she did. Her small printed instruction was still there on the outside of the tape, the letters slightly faded but entirely legible. Read this last, Roosevelt, not before. I had done what she asked. I reached up and worked the tape loose, carefully preserving it out of some instinct I could not have named, and I unfolded the last page and read what my wife had written in the final weeks of her life. The handwriting was different from the rest of the notebook. The entries I had read over the past 6 days had been written in Dorothy's usual hand, controlled and precise, the hand of a woman in full command of her faculties and her purpose. This page was written in a hand that was still recognizably hers, but softer at the edges. The letters formed with care, but at a pace that spoke of effort, of a person concentrating on each word, because the hand required more attention than it once had. She had written Roosevelt. There are things I need to tell you that I did not know how to say out loud without watching you try to fix them. You have spent our whole life together trying to fix things for the people you love. And most of the time, that is one of the best things about you. But some things do not need fixing. Some things only need witnessing. I needed you to witness what Marcus became without trying to stop it from being true. Because the truth of it was the only thing that was ever going to give him a chance at becoming something else. She had written below that in slightly smaller letters, as though the space on the page was becoming precious. I also need to tell you something. I did not tell you when I should have. The doctors told me in April that the prognosis was not what we had hoped. They gave me a number of months that I did not share with you because you had just come through the bypass, and I was not going to put that weight on a heart that was still healing. I am sorry for that. I know you would have wanted to know, but I want you to understand that the months I had after April were not months I spent being afraid. I spent them doing this, building this, making sure that when the time came, you would have what you needed to stand up. Every page of this notebook, and every document in that envelope, and every conversation I had with Cheryl Monroe was a way of being with you after I was gone. That is not a sad thing, Roosevelt. That is the best use I could think of for the time I had left. The final lines of the page were written in the largest letters of anything in the notebook, as though she had wanted to make certain they could not be misread or overlooked. She had written, "You are the strongest man I have ever known, not because you never fell, because every time you got up, you brought somebody with you. Don't close the shop. Open it wider. Let more people in. That is what Daddy James always wanted, and it is what I want. And it is, I think, what you have always wanted too. Even when you were too busy keeping everything together to remember it. I love you, Roosevelt Washington. I have loved you since the day you walked into my mother's church in your good shoes, looking like you owned the place. Take care of yourself. Take care of the shop. Take care of 79th Street. It needs you. I folded the page and held it against my chest for a moment, in the afternoon light of my father's shop. Then, for the first time in more days than I could easily count, I smiled. It was not a complicated smile, and it was not a performed one. It was simply the smile of a man who has just heard the voice of the person he loves most in the world, coming to him across an impossible distance, clear and warm, and entirely itself. My father always said that a man's chair tells you everything about who he is. He did not mean the chair in his living room or the chair at his dining table. He meant the chair he stood behind. The chair where people came and sat down and trusted him with something as close and personal as the top of their head, the frame of their face, the way they presented themselves to the world when they walked back out the door. He said that a man who understood what that chair meant would never be careless with it, would never rush through it, would never treat the person sitting in it as a transaction rather than a trust. He said the chair was a covenant. I had heard him say it so many times over so many years that it had become part of the furniture of my mind, present and familiar, and not quite visible anymore, the way things become when you have lived with them long enough. On the second Saturday morning, after the morning, everything changed. Standing behind my station in the quiet shop before the doors opened, with the tongs in my hand and the tongs warm and familiar against my palm, I finally understood what he meant. Down to the bone. I had been in the shop since before 6, not because anything required it, but because I wanted the time alone in it before the day began. Wanted to move through the space in the early quiet, the way you move through a place that has changed and that you are still in the process of understanding in its new form. The shop looked the same as it always had, the photographs on the walls, the old cabinets my father had built, the barber pole's slow, faithful rotation outside the front window. The flickering bulb now replaced steady and even because I had finally gotten around to fixing it the week before, and had stood on the sidewalk for a moment after doing it and thought about Dorothy and next week and all the things we put off until we understand that we cannot. The mirror she had hung was back on the wall, level and secure, rehung on the morning after the Saturday by Big E, who had arrived early without being asked, and had done it quietly and without comment, because that was who Big E was. Pastor Dwight Coleman knocked on the front door at 8:15. I had not told him to come early. He had simply come the way he had come the Friday night before everything, because he understood, without being told, that some mornings require a witness. I let him in, and he took his coat off and hung it on the hook by the door, and settled into the first chair along the waiting wall with the ease of a man who has been sitting in this room for 30 years and has never once felt out of place in it. He said good morning. I said good morning back. I asked him if he was ready. He said he had been ready since the day Dorothy called him and told him what she was building, and asked if he would be one of the trustees. He said that was 3 years ago, and he had been waiting ever since to see how it turned out. I said, now you know. He said, now I know. Then he stood up and walked to my station and sat down in the chair and looked at himself in the mirror and said, let's get to work, Roosevelt. I fastened the cape around his shoulders and picked up the comb and began the way my father had taught me to begin, with an assessment, running the comb through once from the crown down to get a sense of the weight and the direction before committing to anything. The motion was entirely familiar. It lived in my hands the way all things live that you have done 10,000 times with care and attention, not as a thought, but as a knowledge that exists below thought, reliable and quiet and always there when you reach for it. The clippers came up warm in my palm, and I turned them on, and the sound of them filled the shop the way it had filled it every Saturday morning for 53 years, and something in my chest that had been braced since the morning I came home from the hospital and found the foreclosure notice on my father's counter, quietly and completely released. I looked at myself in the mirror while I worked, not with vanity, but with the particular attention of a man who is trying to see himself clearly. I saw a 64-year-old man in a worn cotton apron with his father's name embroidered on it, standing behind a chair in a shop that had outlasted every attempt to diminish it. I saw the photographs on the wall behind me, My father in his army uniform, the shop on opening day, the decades of faces that had trusted this place with something true about themselves. I saw the mirror Dorothy had hung and rehung and hidden a safe behind, and which now hung level and ordinary and entirely itself on the wall where she had put it. And somewhere in the layered reflection of all of that, in the way the morning light came through the front window and moved across the old wood and the worn tile and the particular smell of pomade and coffee that had not changed in half a century. I saw my father standing where I was standing, and Dorothy sitting where Pastor Coleman was sitting, and I understood that none of this had ever really been about the building or the business. It had always been about the covenant, the agreement that a place makes with the people who need it, and the obligation that agreement creates in the people who tend it. I finished Pastor Coleman's cut and unfastened the cape and brushed the back of his neck with the soft brush my father had used for 40 years and that I had used for 20 after him. He stood and looked in the mirror and nodded with the satisfaction of a man who has received exactly what he came for. The front doorbell rang, and the first of the Saturday morning regulars came in, and then another behind him, and the shop began to fill with the sound and warmth that it had been filling with every Saturday morning since before I was old enough to understand what I was witnessing. I am Roosevelt Washington, and I have been standing behind this chair for 40 years, and my father stood behind it for 30 years before me. And if Dorothy had anything to say about it, and she always did, someone will stand behind it for 30 years after me, and the covenant will hold. If this story reached you in some way that mattered, if something in it reminded you of something true about the people who built things for you before you knew to be grateful, I hope you will carry that with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me about the person in your life who built something and made sure it would last. Subscribe if you want more stories about the people who hold their communities together with nothing but work and love and the refusal to let what matters be taken away. This is 79th Street. This is Washington's Barbershop, and we are still here.